Welcome to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. My name is Mdu. I'm part of the education team here at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And welcome to this book launch today, which is the launch of the book Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany by the renowned author and academic Professor Wolf Gruner. This book launch is a partnership between the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. We appreciate all the support. Before we proceed further with the event, I'd like to ask all of you to please put your phones on silent so that they don't disturb our proceedings. And also, if you've missed any of our live events that take place here at the center, if you go to our YouTube channel, so if you go to our website, which is www.jhbholocaust.co.za, and you click on our YouTube image or our YouTube emblem, then that will take you to our YouTube channel, and there you'll find our previous live events that have been recorded, such as today's event. Thank you very much. This book launch will include a question and answer discussion session with Professor Gruner. At the end of the discussion, Professor Gruner is very happy to sign any purchased copies of the book outside in the foyer. So we look forward to that. However, before we listen to Professor Wolf talking about resistors, we are honored to have with us founder and executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Director Tali Nates. And at this time, it is my privilege to invite Director Nates to open the event for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mdu, and lovely to see you. We missed you. He had a little accident involving his dog, may I say. And we're very happy that you are well enough and back with us. Welcome, everyone. Wonderful to see some friends, new and old, and wonderful to welcome Wolf Gruner here to South Africa. Wolf traveled a long way. He left Los Angeles, I think, 5 days ago, and traveled to New York and worked a little bit in New York, and then traveled via Amsterdam to arrive here very late last night. And he woke up this morning and he was chirpy, and I even managed to show him the Rosebank Market and take him around the center, and that was wonderful. I know Professor Gruner for many years. We spent some time even in Cambodia together in 2019 and admired his work for many years. Serious historian that is coming with so much new, thoughtful research, including this new book that we are launching today, always looking at known history and telling us, but really, do we know that history? Can we see it from another angle? Is there more research that we can look and learn about this history that we think we know it all, but do we? During COVID, Professor Gruner gave 2 excellent talks about his research on Kristallnacht and research on refugees, and that was amazing. And already then we said, have you been in South Africa? And he said, no. So I said, okay, it's time to come. And here he is. And we are so pleased to have you here, launching your book, but also, I think, giving us a little bit of a look into, again, history that we think we know, but do we know really? So looking very much forward to learn from you. Welcome to South Africa. Right? An official?
Thank you, Director Nates. Thank you. Yes, I have to sort of introduce you officially to everyone and also introduce the book. I know that Professor Gruner will speak more, of course, about the book, but just to sort of like give you a little taste. And this is also written in the book. So Jewish resistance during the Holocaust is still understood mostly in terms of rare armed group activities in the Nazi-occupied East. For example, ghetto uprisings or partisan activities. Resistors is based on a broader definition of resistance and introduces 5 new categories of resistance. The book shows how between 1933 and 1945, Jews performed countless resistance acts in Nazi Germany by destroying Nazi symbols, publicly protesting against the persecution, disobeying Nazi laws and local restrictions, and defending themselves from verbal insults, as well as physical attacks. Wolf Gruner holds the Chapelle Goering Chair in Jewish Studies and is professor of history at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles since 2008. He's the founding director of the University of Southern California Don Seif Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. He's a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. He has published extensively on this topic. He received his PhD in history from the Technical University in Berlin in 1994, 30 years ago, as well as his habilitation in 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Wolf Gruner.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much, Tali, for the invitation, which really make a wish come true, because I always wanted to come for South Africa. I just shared with Tali that I teach a class on comparative genocide, where I actually also teach the history of South Africa as a comparative study. And so I know quite a bit about South African history, but I never came here. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And I hope you can understand me. And I wanted to say what Tali said is to discover new sides of history. I'm selfish, because you can't study 30 years or 40 years a topic always in the same way. And I think I need to discover new sides to kind of make it interesting to me. Otherwise, you couldn't sustain it. And so I always try to kind of question what we know, and also to then not only question what we know, but then also to find material which challenges, contests these old kind of traditional views. And this is what is kind of the essence of this book. So what I want to do in this talk is I will give you first one story, which is one chapter of the book. Then I will talk a little bit about why we have kind of this traditional understanding what Jewish resistance during the Holocaust was. And then I try to explain why we had this and why was this limiting our view. And then I will show you briefly kind of what kind of different acts of resistance I found in the archives and how they enlighten our understanding of individual Jewish resistance. So let me start with the one story. This is the story of Hans Oppenheimer. And Hans Oppenheimer was 17 years old in the year of 1940. So this is the time when the war... 1940. So this was when the time when the war had already begun. Germany had occupied Poland and France and the Netherlands. So in the fall of 1940, in Frankfurt, the young boy, Hans Oppenheimer, was leaving his house every night, and he broke the curfew for Jews every night. So the curfew was introduced a year earlier for Jews. So he broke the curfew every night, and then waited in the pitch dark in Frankfurt and until the Allied bombers started to circle in on Frankfurt, and when they started to drop their bombs and the fire alarm sirens started to blare, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and set off a fire alarm. But not where the actual bombing, the burned houses were, but in a street which had nothing to do with the bombing, to divert the firefighters from the actual burning houses. And sometimes he did this actually twice. He waited till the firefighters came, Then they realized no burning house. They left, and then he set off a wrong fire alarm again. So he did this a dozen of times, and the question is, how did he get to this moment? So he was the firstborn son of a Jewish merchant in Frankfurt who sold kind of linens to tailors in Frankfurt. The family had a good life. They lived in a big apartment in an imposing boulevard in Frankfurt West End, where a lot of wealthy Jewish families lived. And in 1933, he finished elementary school, but the Nazis had, or Hitler had already taken power, so his family or his parents decided to put him not in a public school for middle school, but in one of the most prestigious and famous Jewish private schools in Frankfurt or in whole Germany, the Philanthropin. And the Philanthropin was not only one of the best Jewish schools, but it was also able to shield the Jewish students a little bit from this hostile, increasingly hostile environment in Frankfurt. So when he finished middle school with very good grades, he decided not to go to high school because of the persecution in Germany. His family had lost his income. So his father has lost his business. The increasing persecution in Frankfurt especially created a very hostile environment. The Nazi mayor was one of the most anti-Jewish fanatics. He immediately cut business ties to Jewish businesses in 1933. Frankfurt was the first city in Germany to reduce welfare benefits for poor Jews. Frankfurt was also one of the first cities to Aryanize or expropriate Jewish art collections, Jewish private foundations, and Jewish real estate. So in this hostile environment, he thought the best way to do is actually to do an apprenticeship, to get kind of practical skills and get a real job to, in the short run, help the family, but in the long run, to actually be better able to emigrate, because a craft, a skill would help him to kind of get better perspectives to emigrate. So he did an apprenticeship as a blacksmith in a newly opened private kind of Jewish school, where teenagers were educated or kind of trained as blacksmiths, gardeners, carpenters. And when he finished his apprenticeship, also again with good kind of outcomes, he registered at the Frankfurt Labor Office to get a job. The Labor Office drafted or recruited him as a Jewish forced laborer. And this is in the spring of 1939, and is the outcome of a very early forced labor program which was introduced in Nazi Germany after Kristallnacht, which is not so well known, but targeted Jews who were unemployed and received unemployment benefits. So the decision was to not let them kind of get benefits without forced labor. So he was sent to a forced labor camp as a 16-year-old boy in a vicinity of Frankfurt. And after a few months, he was sent back to Frankfurt, and the labor office sent him to another labor camp. And in this labor camp, there he was supposed to build with other Jewish men a road from this town, which was called Kelkheim, to Frankfurt. The conditions in this labor camp in this town were horrible. The mayor was very anti-Jewish. He segregated the Jewish laborers from the local inhabitants. He ordered actually frequent beatings of the Jewish men to supposedly enhance their productivity. But it was really, the circumstances were horrible, and this is really the time early in the war in Germany. And the conditions were so bad that one of the laborers actually committed suicide in the camp. So when he was released from this labor camp, In the summer of 1940, he was transferred back to Frankfurt and started to work for the municipality first and then for a private company. And after this experience of these two forced labor camps, this is the moment when he decided to do something. So he started to set off these wrong fire alarms, and he was caught after several weeks of doing this. And the reason was that because of the curfew, he was not daring to kind of get far from his home. So all the fire alarms were actually set off in the vicinity of his kind of home. He still lived with his parents at this time. He was only 17 years old. And one day, to be precise, on December 10th, 1940, at 10 p.m., he was caught in a trap when he was about to kind of set off the next fire alarm. He was interned in pre-trial detention for several months and was then indicted charged with several felonies according to the German Criminal Code and for offenses under the new war decree against so-called public vermins, during the war. The written indictment emphasized that Hans Oppenheimer was a Jew, and the prosecutor pointed out that the Gestapo had assessed that Hans Oppenheimer was unstable, lazy, and a dishonest human being who really kind of was eager to destroying things. This was in the indictment written. Under the interrogation by the Gestapo, he only admitted to 9 wrong fire alarms. However, the prosecutor assumed that he was responsible for way more than this because there was a series of wrong fire alarms in his neighborhood which amounted to 44 wrong fire alarms which started when he came back and ended with his arrest. You can imagine, kind of make the equation here. So he was put on trial. He actually was somehow lucky to evade the death penalty for treason because they couldn't really kind of make this construction that this was treason. So he was kind of put on trial for several other charges, and the prosecutor asked for 6 years. But the judge was actually a little bit more lenient. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It was not, adult law was not applied because he was 17. But the judge in his verdict still said that Hans should have actually obeyed the German laws because as a Jew, he was only a guest in Germany. In the back, can you hear me well? Yes. Good. So he was transferred to a small prison, and from the very first day he was kind of put in solitary confinement. He had to, as many prisoners, to do labor, folding envelopes and bags day in, day out, but the isolation and the prison conditions in general took a heavy toll on him, physically and emotionally. He developed kind of skin rashes, kind of painful teeth cavities because there was no health care. And the only lifeline he had was to write letters to his family, to his parents. And he begged them to visit him, to send him medicine and so on. He still kind of, although this took an emotional toll on him, he still kind of petitioned the prison warden for better conditions, and he was criticizing the horrible condition in prison. It was so that the parents got kind of news from the prison that the son was still rebellious, and they wrote him letters saying, calm down, don't kind of do this, it will make your situation even more horrible. So he wrote back to his parents, and many of his letters actually never arrived at his parents That's how I got a hold of them, because I found his prison file. They were filed kind of on shelves by the prison warden, and because they were confiscated because of his outspoken nature about the horrible prison conditions. So he wrote to his parents saying, thinking about his life would make him go crazy. Because he said to his parents in his letter, and I quote, "You know best that I never had the chance to visit a cinema, a cabaret, or a theater." End of quote. The situation was taking such a toll on him that he tried twice to commit suicide. Unsuccessfully. The guards kind of saved him twice. And towards the end of the second year, he then suffered his fate because of arrangement between the Reich Justice Minister and the head of the SS. They kind of came to an agreement to transfer all Jewish prisoners from prisons, from regular prisons, to concentration camps, which meant at the end of 1942 that they not were transferred to German concentration camps, but to Auschwitz. So he was moved to Auschwitz, and there he didn't survive for long, only a few weeks, and his death was registered on January 30th, 1943. This was only a few days after he had turned 20 years old. So what does his story kind of tell us and help us to understand about Jewish responses towards the Nazi persecution? So during the Third Reich, the Nazis often complained about the so-called impudent Jew. In March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen wrote in a report that, quote, "The number of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous and often impudent in their tone," end of quote. Even during the war in 1941 and 1941, the Reich Main Security Office of the SS in Berlin kind of reported that they received from all corners of the Reich reports that the Jews kind of often criticized anti-Jewish measures and the persecution in a very impudent attitude. Historians, and here I include myself, we often thought the mentioning of the impudent Jews in these Nazi reports was actually just a pretext to introduce new radical measures against the Jews. But there was a grain of truth to these reports, because in 1935 in Berlin, in July, the Gestapo wrote in a report that Jews were born with disrespect to state authority. That's a quote. And we have to note that in the same months, more than 100 Berlin Jews were arrested for attacks against the Nazi state. More than 100 Jews in Berlin in 1 month. And later, even during the war, there were Jews kind of arrested for political offenses, for critique, public protest, and other crimes, so that at the end of 1942, like Hans Oppenheimer, 1,200 Jews were in prison in Germany for these kind of offenses. And this is 2% of the remaining German Jewish population, which kind of translates, I don't look up the number of inhabitants in South Africa, but in the US, when you take 330 million US inhabitants or citizens, it would be 6 million people in jail for resistance. That's the kind of relation, to the Jewish population in Germany. So what I can say with my research is that the Nazi complaints about the impudent Jews point to a forgotten reality of a quite large number of kind of individual acts of resistance, and we need to reassess actually our understanding of Jewish responses during the Holocaust, specifically in Nazi Germany. And I think my research shows and challenges the idea that Jews in general, but particularly German Jews, were passive towards kind of the Nazi persecution. And I think the traditional understanding or notion that Jews were mostly passive, with exceptions, based on two main reasons. One was a very kind of narrow conceptual understanding what resistance is, and the second one was a limited pool of sources. And I will briefly speak to both of these aspects. So the one was already mentioned by you, that the traditional understanding of resistance is group resistance, organized resistance, armed resistance, mostly in Eastern Europe, the partisans, uprising, the parachuters, and so on. However, this was already challenged in 1945 in the early decades by Israeli scholars who pointed to kind of what they call day-to-day resistance or Amidah. However, in the broader scholarly community, this was never really settling in. So in the end, in most standard Holocaust works, you will find only kind of group and armed resistance as Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. So what I did was not very original. I kind of broadened the definition of resistance based on earlier approaches by, for example, the Israeli survivor Me'id Wojcicki, the Australian historian Konrad Kviet, and an East German survivor Helmut Eschwege. And I forgot the clicker. Can I have the clicker now? Oh, where is it? Oh, it's so small. Okay, good. So, oh, it works. So what I did is very simple. I took a very widely known and used definition by the prominent Israeli scholar Yehuda Bauer and added just in gray individual. And in my view, and I hope you will agree after the talk, is this changes everything. And I will illustrate this with some pictures. The first picture is a picture which we use usually to illustrate the first wave of terror against Jews in Germany by stormtroopers in the early weeks and months of 1933. This is Munich, and this is Michael Siegel. He is a Jewish lawyer and dragged by the stormtroopers. They cut his pants off to humiliate him. So if we look closer, this was not a random act of violence against any Jew. It was particular targeted violence because the sign says in German, I won't complain at the police station anymore. So he tried to release a client of his from the police station against the will, and the police actually handed him over to the stormtroopers. What year was that? This is 33, early 1933. So the next picture is I used in my class when I talk about the initiative role of city governments when they prohibited access to public facilities like parks or, in this case, swimming pool. However, look at the body language of this woman. And maybe this raises the question also, why is she actually taking a picture in front of the pool which she can't access? Yeah? So, or this is my, the same is true for this Jewish family from a small town. They let their son take a picture of them in front of one of the most notorious anti-Jewish slogans which somebody painted the day before on their house, on the wall of their house. Or, this is my favorite picture, and it's the cover of the book. That's Lizzie Rosenfeld in Vienna. She is a Jewish woman who sits on the bench. Look at the sign which she has her hand over. In German it says, only for Aryans. So that meant not for Jews. So think about it. She sits with this body language, embracing this hostile kind of anti-Jewish slogan there, lets her friend take a picture, and then smuggles this negative out of Austria when she emigrates to the United States. And not only taking pictures of these obvious acts of defiance, but also taking pictures of the Nazi crimes was actually in itself an act of resistance. And this is the topic of my next book, is the destruction of Jewish homes during Kristallnacht. And this is a picture by Hans Sachs, who kind of documented the destruction of his own apartment during Kristallnacht. So, my book, in a way, tries to change our understanding of what Jewish resistance is. We can see that the kind of anti-Jewish individual acts are much more widespread than we ever thought. And what I want to do is to share with you now. Oh, I forgot the second aspect. I have to first talk about the sources. So, previously, historians, when they thought about how to document Jewish attitudes, they would resort to two types of sources. One was perpetrator sources, and they were usually the Nazi reports which I mentioned, like Gestapo, SS, but they never really wanted to talk about Jewish resistance because the idea was the Jew is weak. So how would they kind of detail anti-Jew or kind of anti-Nazi kind of acts? So you barely find in these reports acts of individual resistance. The second source were ego documents, like diaries or letters. But letters were censored. Diaries were written also under the fear of censorship. So in a way, they almost never talk about individual acts of defiance or disobedience. So what I did in my research is I used two types of sources which are never used for this purpose. They were police logbooks of police precincts in Berlin, police records, court records, especially of special courts, and then I added testimonies of the USC Shore Foundation in exactly 170 testimonies of German Jewish survivors. I added to the mix. And with them, they are the foundation of my work. I also use letters, I also use reports, but that's kind of minimal. The majority of my sources are these news sources. And most of the police records and the court records I found in a variety of German local archives in Berlin, where I started my work. Then I went to Frankfurt, to Leipzig, Dresden, Hamburg, Vienna, Munich, and also smaller towns. I got kind of evidence via Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So, total different set of sources and a very different approach kind of is the foundation of this new perspective. And now I want to share a little bit of the results of this research with you. So, as already mentioned, in the book I have 5 chapters. Each chapter stands for one type of resistance. I tell one large story, like the story of Hans Oppenheimer, and then I show at the end of each chapter that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, so this is not just one story, which is accidental. This is really a more kind of wider stream of individual acts of resistance. So let me share some stories from the book with you, from my research. So contesting Nazi propaganda. Right in 1933, Jews started to kind of rip down Nazi flags, kind of destroy anti-Jewish propaganda posters, besmear displays of the anti-Semitic newspaper, the Stürmer, and one case which I document in the book more in detail is the story of David Bornstein. David Bornstein lived in Hamburg. He was kind of almost nearly his 40s. He was a merchant, and one a nice summer day, he accompanied his wife to the bus terminal at the outskirts of Hamburg, and waiting for the departure of the bus, he tried to destroy the swastika on the local bus. Hello? Yes. Oh, there it is. Oh, shoot. This was too fast. Sorry. If you look closer, can you see the scratches on the swastika? Yeah, here. So, And to understand how he did this with his walking cane, this is the next picture. This is not David Bornstein. This is one of the first examples of historical reenactment, in this case by the Gestapo. So this is a Gestapo officer kind of trying to show how David Bornstein, with his walking cane, scratched the swastika while talking to his wife upstairs in the bus window. And by the way, this is not his wife, this is the bus conductor who denunciated David Bornstein. Yeah?
The window.
So, no, he is, David was standing in front of and was talking to his wife and was kind of scratching the swastika. So, after the denunciation, he was arrested and he was put on trial and was punished with 5 weeks in jail for these scratches. 5 weeks seems not much. However, the conditions for Jews in a German prison were not easy, but more consequent, there was a much more kind of hidden consequence of this. When he was released, he had a criminal record. In 1938, there was a German-wide raid against so-called asocials, and they were put into concentration camps. And kind of piggybacking on this raid, the Gestapo arrested 2,500 Jews with criminal records. And we always thought these were mainly Jews who kind of were arrested for DUIs, I mean drunk driving, or for smoking in woods in the summer when there is kind of fire danger. But now I realize that Jews, male Jews who criticized or did something against the regime, went on trial, went to prison, they were all sent to concentration camps because of their criminal records during this raid. He was lucky, he was released, he survived, and immediately after he came back to Hamburg, took his wife and his daughter, and they emigrated to Palestine and survived. And still during the war, Jews ripped down Nazi flags, for example, in Leipzig, so this is not ending like in the 1930s. Similar things you can find in documented for later times. Now, no, this was so oral protest. This is actually how my research started, because in a Berlin logbook I found the first arrest note about a Jewish man who protested against the persecution in public. And this is what triggered my interest, because I never came across in my earlier research that somebody in public protested as a Jew against the persecution. So right in the beginning of 1933, many Jews protested, for example, in Frankfurt and in other cities, and were put on trial and went to prison for the critique of the early wave of terror, what we have seen in this picture, right? The stormtrooper beating up Jews in the streets or bringing them to wild concentration camps. And later on, the critique never stopped. So, for example, during Kristallnacht, the Kristallnacht was one of the moments where there was a kind of a spike of Jewish public critique against the persecution. As, for example, Henriette Schäfer, she went to a shop the day after the pogrom. She entered the shop and said to the store owner, "What are you thinking?" And I quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. And the store owner said, kind of responded along the German propaganda lines, the Nazi propaganda lines, saying, "Yeah, this is the outrage of the people because in Paris the Jew assassinated our diplomat." And then she said, no, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. This is one other chapter in the book. She received 6 months in prison for this comment. Yeah? And she was punished under this law, as many of those Jews, male and female, who criticized the regime and the persecution. This is the law against treacherous attacks against the Nazi state. We always thought this law was against communists and social democrats, but my research showed that countless Jews actually went to prison using this law against them. Even during the war, this kind of public oral protest didn't stop. So, for example, Hertha Reis, she was 36 years old. At the time, she was a forced laborer. She exclaimed in front of the public courthouse in Berlin, quote, saying, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against," end of quote. In her case, we don't know what happened to her, so I don't have records if she went on trial, if she was, what happened to her. We only know that she committed suicide a year later. I don't have a picture of her, that's why I wanted to at least share another picture of somebody similar.
Turn it around.
Oh, that's the wrong side. Okay. And then this one. Yeah, okay. This was the problem. Okay. So this is Gabriele Reich from Vienna, who in 1942 was arrested for publicly insulting Hitler, making comments against the persecution of the Jews, and for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. She got 10 months in prison for kind of the summary of all her crimes.
When did she die?
I don't have more records of her. I only found the verdict of her, and I don't know more. Sometimes, even when I did more biographical research, sometimes we have lacks in our or gaps in our research, in our sources. So the next. Okay, good. So, oh yeah, now it worked. That's good. Okay, so the next one is written protest. And the written protest is a large variety of different ways to protest against the persecution. The more known way are petitions. Jews wrote countless petitions towards local administrations, the Hitler government, ministries, Nazi party branches. We usually thought they were written in vain, so nobody really took them seriously. However, new research shows that first of all, we need to take them seriously, because in some cases they actually saved the authors' lives, because the Germans took them seriously. They actually spent manpower and time on responding to these petitions. But moreover, the authors in their petitions also reclaimed their own identities as Jews, as citizens, as contributors to the fatherland. And so these are actually very important statements of the Jews themselves. And they signed them with names when they criticized certain measures. So this was also kind of somehow risky. And this happened a lot over the whole time span, but especially when there were new laws or violent kind of events. And in 1935, there were these kind of events, and this is good, exactly. So in Berlin, shop owners who were attacked, they wrote petitions. But there were other Jews who actually witnessed the riots against Jews, and they wrote anonymous leaflets. Like in this case, this is not a leaflet, this is a police record, and it said in the leaflet, I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I am a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler, exclamation mark," end of quote. So, even during the war, Jews did not stop with kind of these various kind of forms of written resistance. And can I have the next slide? Yeah. So in Munich, there is a 71-year-old man, Benno Neuburger. He was a former real estate broker, and he was living through the 1930s in a very kind of depressing situation because his children emigrated in the 1930s to the United States. He and his wife could only witness the marriages of their children in the United States per letters. They could only kind of hear about the birth of their grandchildren via these letters and a rare occasional photograph. They tried to get out of Germany, but were not able to. And so when the Yellow Star was introduced, the notorious Yellow Star, I think this was what kind of was the last straw which broke the camel's back in the case of Benno Neuburger. So he decided, he took these post stamps of Hitler, put them on postcards, and then he wrote anti-Hitler comments on them. Can I have the next slide?
Sorry, before you go back to that stamp, if I had that stamp, I would have stuck on the front of the stamp. The way it is.
So these are the postcards here, and you see either he wrote on the stamps or he wrote on a postcard, and it says, "The eternal murderer Hitler, disgusting!" exclamation mark. And the most prophetic one is the one on the right. It says, "Murderer of 5 million." And this was at the end of 1941, where not many, first of all, the extermination just started, and not many people in Germany actually knew about this. So he wrote more than a dozen of these postcards, anonymous, sent them out by mail, and he was caught by the Gestapo because he did one mistake. He used one postcard of his old real estate firm. And that's how they got a hold of him. The Nazis and the Gestapo, can I have the next? Yeah. He didn't send them to anybody. They were without kind of anything. He just put them in the mail. So the post officers, they received them, and he hoped that they read them and that they might distribute them. So he wrote also in the record, there are gaps in the record. So not every postcard was actually submitted to the Gestapo. Yeah, so there are obvious gaps of a month or two in the record. So, but he was, and I hope you can see this, in the middle picture, he has a bruise under, yeah? So he was tortured by the Gestapo, and still after torture, he kind of stood by his conviction that that he hated Hitler, and even later he was put on trial at the notorious Nazi People's Court in Berlin for treason. And even where at this stage where only show trials happened, and the outcome was clear from the very beginning, he stood there and in broad public kind of said that he hated Hitler for the persecution of the Jews and for his announcement of that Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews. And he suffered the gravest of consequences, so he was punished with the death penalty and decapitated in September 1942. Can I have the next? Huh? Yeah. And I mean, he knew about the consequences because he did this. His wife was not aware what he was doing until the very end. She never realized what he was doing until after he was murdered, actually. So, yeah. Yeah, there was one in Berlin in a prison which was used especially against kind of high-profile resistors, communists, but also Jewish, the very not well known but very important anti-Jewish resistance group in Berlin, the Herbert Baum group. 20 of them were also decapitated by the guillotine. So Okay, I have to go on because the time is flying. So the next one is disobedience of laws, and this is kind of a whole spectrum from kind of disobedience, of Nazi laws, of racial kind of sexual relations, but also not going to swimming pools, theaters, libraries. So that was very widespread. Hans Oppenheimer fell also under the category of disobedience of German laws. And interesting is, a lot of this happened which we are not aware or never thought of. So for example, you all know that Jews had to adopt the middle names Sarah and Israel, right? They were discriminatory middle names in Germany, which Jews had to adopt to be identified as Jews. So, but this was not that this happened overnight just because the Nazis said this. In Germany, there was a name law, and the name law requested that you need to fill out a form and apply for the name change. You pay 3 Reichsmark and ask for the name change. So quite a few Jews actually never filled out this form. And some resisted even when they were summoned to the police station, and some of them not even discovered. For example, Ida Schneider in Leipzig, she was only discovered 2 years later. In 1941, during the war, by an occasional raid by the Gestapo, that she was without kind of the name, and that she also didn't carry identification papers marked with J. So this was especially done by elderly Jews, I think because the name change was much more impactful for them than for younger kind of teenagers or so. And the last example in this category is Max Mannheimer. He was a forced laborer at a road construction site, and he is the only one who actually left what I know, a comment about his own resistance in his diary, and I want to quote from his diary. He wrote, "My home is a wooden hut behind a tool shed. From there I go to the public park, despite the 8 p.m. curfew, and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way, I count the signs with the slogan, 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total, there are 6. Later, at 11 p.m. at night, I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them into the bushes and some of them into the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had re-emerged. For a second time, I did not have the courage. I'm just not a hero." End of quote. So, I hope you disagree a little bit with his own kind of judgment about himself, because it was very courageous to even go back, breaking again kind of 2 German regulations, the ban of the public park visiting and then also the curfew. So I think he was very courageous. And downplaying his actions was a problem for my research because, for example, in testimonies of survivors, they often they didn't recognize what they did as resistance, because they also clung to this old notion, resistance is only armed and organized. So the last category is physical self-defense, and this was the most surprising to me. To come across, and it was also the most difficult to kind of find traces of, because physical altercations never left traces in German archive unless there was a political context or connotation. So when somebody a Jew was beat up a Nazi and was say, "You Nazis, you're all kind of shitty guys," or "Hitler is a murderer," then there would be a trace. Because this would have consequences. But if it was a simple physical beat up, even if the Nazi said something about the Jew, there was no trace in the archive of this. So we know only from testimonies of survivors in the Shoah Foundation that, for example, Jewish men of younger age, but also middle-aged men, beat up stormtroopers who harassed kind of neighbors, for example. They beat up stormtroopers who insulted them in the street. I found 30 testimonies of Jews who were teenagers who defended themselves physically against attacks by Hitler Youth members or teenagers in their neighborhood or schoolmates. And interestingly, of the 30s, 11 were girls who not only defended themselves physically against male attackers, female attackers, but also male attackers. And my favorite story is one in a testimony saying, so after the third day when they again harassed me, I turned around and hit kind of the most aggressive male attacker in his mouth and knocked his teeth out. But the main story in my book is actually from Daisy Golonovsky, another woman. She was 16 years old and she lived in a retraining camp where the teenagers were prepared for the immigration to Palestine by getting agricultural skills. These retraining camps all over Germany were raided during Kristallnacht. They were destroying the furniture, they beat up the teenagers and the teachers, and often, in all cases, arrested the teachers, and in many cases also the male students. In her case, the stormtrooper raided the camp, beat up the boys, and now, can I have the next one?
The kids, you know, the youngsters, and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden, I came my turn. I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0" I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden, it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back. And that was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl. What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back. It hurt. And I got to the end of the line. One of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand. I used the knife. I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it, and they dragged him underneath a bed, or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off. We ran, all of us. And they started covering after, then give up on it.
So she escaped with several of her friends.
Yes.
Now we need to stop this. Okay. So she was one of the interesting individuals who had whole, what I call resistance careers, because they not just did it once. She kind of rebelled several times. So before this, even as a kind of 14-year-old, she helped kind of a communist underground group as a messenger. She was trained, and this explains the trick. The trick was actually a jiu-jitsu trick, which she learned in a self-defense training in a Hashomer Hatzair group in Berlin when she was like 13 or 14 years old. And then when she escaped from the camp with her friends, they found shelter at a farmer nearby whom they used to work for, And then the next day they were kind of dragged out by the stormtroopers again, caught, arrested. They escaped again, and in the end she made it to Cologne, where the Jewish community put her on a train to England. So she escaped to England and ended up in Los Angeles. So she survived. So let me come to the conclusion. So I think, or let me rephrase it. So 3 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the 30-year-old Edith Britz wrote a letter that was intercepted by the Gestapo. The Jewish woman from Berlin described in the letter that one morning at 6 a.m., 2 police officers knocked on her door. And she wrote, and I quote, "I am so upset that I could attack anybody who wants to come into my pad. I will go crazy. If there will be more. They stole my sleep. They stole everything from me." End of quote. And I think this citation reveals a little bit of the accumulated anger and anxiety of many Jews, what they felt after years of kind of persecution, discrimination, humiliation. And I think these kind of emotions might have motivated quite a few of these individual acts of resistance. So by defining Jewish resistance as any individual or group action against Nazi laws, actions, and plans, changes our perspective dramatically. I have to bring in a caveat. Although my research brought to light hundreds and hundreds of cases of defiance and protest and other forms of resistance, there are still too many archives untouched. And then many cases were also not denunciated, as we know from the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation of survivors. So many incidents never left traces for the historian. However, what I try to do with the pool of sources I found is to kind of subsume them under these 5 categories which I shared with you. And what I want to make as a general assessment is, and this is I think the most important outcome beyond changing the notion of passivity, is that there was no pattern which I can identify of resistance or of people, because equally women as men, protested, committed other acts of defiance. There's no difference when we look at age. There were teenagers to until 80-year-old people. There is no difference in educational background from blue-collar worker to people with doctoral degrees. There is no difference in social upbringings, rural versus kind of city environment. So I think my research kind of in a way challenges a lot of the research which was done in the 1960s and 70s, which tried to explain from standpoints of psychologists why people act. And they explained it often with character traits, belief systems, and so on. This research points to that everybody actually is capable of individual resistance. And it depends much more on situation than on other things. And so one can only say that each individual developed particular individual responses to the persecution. And there is a quote summarizing this from the 1960s. The Berlin rabbi, survivor Max Nussbaum, said or wrote, I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners." End of quote. Some might think, are these small acts really resistance? So my point of view is, it is not up to me as a scholar, it's not even up to the survivors to say this was resistance. The only actual practically argument can be when the perpetrator judged that this is a threat to them, the most minor act was resistance. And even if you didn't do something, it could be perceived as resistance. For example, not wearing the star was punished with jail time. So, to appreciate and to commemorate the courageous effort of so many men, women, I think our standard Holocaust narrative needs to be changed. Stories like the one of Hans Oppenheimer or Hertha Reis needs to be incorporated in our narrative. And when we understand Jewish men and women as historical actors, then this old notion of Jewish passivity is obsolete once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent. Really, thank you. Many times, as part of our education program, we do focus on resistance. And these stories, I mean, we speak about armed resistance, we speak about cultural resistance. And these little stories that you shared with us will definitely go a long way when we speak to students about daily acts of individual and then focus on that word individual resistance. So thank you very much for that. I think we'll take this to great use as part of our program. I know there are many questions, so I will take up more time. So yes, I'll start.
Can I say something? Thank you. Did I get first say?
Yeah, totally.
Professor, I've always been interested in the small stories, which I think are big stories. What you said at the end resonates very strongly for me. I have repeated the story in this forum a few years ago. I attended a lecture, not here, about a rabbi in, I think it was Auschwitz, who smuggled his 13-year-old, about to be 13-year-old son into the barracks. He did a bar mitzvah ceremony under cover under the sheets, and I get quite emotional. The present he gave his son for his bar mitzvah was a small piece of chocolate. Now for me, that's a big resistance, because if he had been caught, they both would have been dead. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hans, Professor, thank you. I really enjoyed what you said, and I think it's a lesson for all of us. And I want to disagree with you on something. You said, how do we decide if something's resistance? And it's not only from the perpetrator's point of view, because as a Jew, to not really be defined by a perpetrator, yes, the resistance can be seen from different points of view. The perpetrator can see resistance, but ultimately also, it's what did the Jew do? How did they feel? They knew the risk they were taking. Maybe years later they didn't think it was so great or so serious. Just like the righteous among the nations don't think that what they did was so great or so serious. They just thought it was, well, that's what every person should do. So I think maybe understanding resistance has to be more than that. That's my one point. My other point is, I think also coming from a background of South Africa, where there was so much resistance to apartheid. We also know that it wasn't just, let's say, organized groups. It was individual people. Individual people just talking to another person as a human being. Or even today, with so much poverty, so many individual people might make sandwiches and give them out on the side of the road. Not part of a charity organization, but they contributing in some way. So I think your research about individuals is really excellent, so thank you.
Yeah, I want to respond. Yeah. So for both, I have kind of a response. So first of all, I don't think that when I said the perpetrators kind of define the resistance, it's not about the persons. It's about the act of resistance. They define what kind of acts they perceive as a threat. And I think this points to the second question. We don't understand, when we live in an open society, in a democratic society, what these small acts actually meant, and for the kind of perpetrators and why they were actually persecuted. I just want to share one example of this. So when where do I have this? Let me see. So 2 examples from the recent history in Russia. There was, I don't know if you remember or heard about this, there was a woman sitting on a red square with a blank sheet of paper. There was nothing written on it. She was just sitting there, and she was arrested for anti-war propaganda. And the same is true for this year. This is a report about somebody got 8 years in jail in Russia for kind of besmearing a pro-war propaganda poster in Moscow. Yeah? So this is what they perceive as a threat, which we in an open society would say, okay, there's a tag or a graffiti, nobody cares. I think we can't really imagine the kind of consequences and repercussions these small things had, these minor things. And that's why I'm saying, in the end, they decide what they perceive as resistance. Yeah? The other argument is, if you would say somebody as Jew should be able to say what resistance is, we have two problems. One is, most of the survivors would say, what I referred to, they never thought of this as resistance. We have testimonies where they said Jews didn't really resist except in Warsaw or in the partisans. And then they tell the story that from their family, they lost their shop. This was Aryanized. They still lived in the back of the house. And then the Nazi who took over the shop put a sign in for Jews forbidden. And then the mother crossed out the U in German for Jew and put an E in, which means for everybody forbidden. So it says we never resisted, but the mother actually did. But they didn't perceive this as resistance. And I think that's a crucial problem, what I want to change, that we think about resistance in a different way. And then there is also a traditional Jewish discussion about did Jews in history resist? And there are two different opinions on this. So, for example, in the book I cite a letter exchange between two very famous German Jewish writers, Arnold Zweig and Kurt Tucholsky. They talked in 1935 about the need of resistance. And then Tucholsky said, yeah, but nobody is really resisting. In our history, there is just no resistance, which is not true, but there is this self-understanding of this, that's like Jews adapt, yeah, because of the violent history, because open resistance is too risky. So there are all these problems then which come to my mind when I think about this side to just let's say Jews define what resistance is.
No.
Okay. I've got two questions. The one is that I was surprised, and I also read it in books that I read, that the German actually took people to trial. Right? Because I mean, they could have just killed them without a trial.
Yeah.
So that's one question. And the other question is, were there individual resistance outside of Germany as well that are recorded?
Yeah, very good. Very important question. So, first of all, there was similar kind of resistance, for example, in Bohemia, Moravia, where I did more research, and I wrote a book about the persecution of the Jews in Bohemia, Moravia, and I have sub-chapters which show very similar acts and also similar persecution by trial by the German kind of protectorate. And I think the trial, I come across this quite often, that the question, because there is in the public a very simplistic understanding what the Holocaust was, and it doesn't take into account, it developed very differently in different territories. So in Germany, it was not like in Poland during the war that somebody would kind of escape from the ghetto and would be killed. In Germany, even if you would escape from a labor camp, they would not just shoot you on the street. And I think we have to take into account, in Germany proper, the Nazis still had an understanding that this is a legal state. Yeah? It is a weakened legal state, but it was a legal state. And that when there were laws, even anti-Jewish laws, if they were broken, there was not the consequence to put somebody in concentration camp or to kill them. The consequence was, you broke the law, you go on trial. And in the book, I have even more interesting facts about the legal system, because with the simplistic understanding, you would never imagine that Jews were actually acquitted. Yeah, I only told stories about who got punished, but there are quite a few Jews who protested in public and judges acquitted them, even during the war. So how can this be? When we think about this, our normal understanding from like Nazification, which is kind of increasing over time, but that's not how people operate. People operate, and this is similar to the resistance, under situational circumstances. And so in these trials, for example, the judge would kind of take into account if witnesses were reliable, if the defense was reliable. Yeah, and so the same judge could, for example, in one case I found one judge in Hamburg. The judge in early 1941, punished somebody with several months in jail, like for similar cases what we discussed, yeah, protest in public. At the end of 1941, a woman went into a police station, shouted, "Down with Hitler," got arrested, was put on trial, and the judge gave her 2 weeks in jail. And the reasoning was that he acted out of despair. He had just kind of punished several months earlier for a very similar act, somebody with several months in prison. And then several months later, to kind of challenge the idea that he might have been thought about Germans lose the war or something, that he got kind of a little bit more, less radical. No, several months later, he punished another Jew for a similar act, again with several months in prison. So it is about the individual circumstances, situation, the international situation sometimes plays a role. So it is very complex. Yeah? History is extremely complex. The human actions are extremely complex. And I think the more we dig, the more complex it will be. However, it also, I think, helps us to understand better and has many more connections to today or to other places. And so I would say, when we approach resistance in this way, not only can we find similar acts in other occupied territories, annexed territories in Nazi Europe, but this is also applicable to other forms of or cases of mass violence and genocide. I found, for example, similar deliberations from scholars who studied slavery in the United States. Yeah, very similar acts of individual resistance. And so there are a lot of kind of connections there.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Professor Gruner, thanks for the reports. I see you focused in your report very much on the working, normal population, Jewish German population. And my question is twofold. One is, what about the famous Jewish people, like writers, like musicians, like, especially in Vienna, the community was full of that, and the religious schooling and so on. What about this? And the second thing is, the Jewish communities in Germany and Austria was highly organized. I'm sure the committees, I'm not sure what we call them, like deputies here as well. What was the resistance of these organizations?
Okay, that's also, again, these are very good questions. So I focused more on kind of the not well-known people for a reason, because we have a lot of individual stories about famous Jews. And I think in some of these cases, you have similar reactions of them. And also some suffered greatly when they resisted. Regarding the organization, so when I wrote my book, I was very conscious about, to challenge the myth, I needed to focus on individuals. So I left out that individuals, I talked briefly in the conclusion about this, that Jews, or individuals in general, never left in a vacuum. They always had relationships. They had their family, they had their friends, they had their neighbors, they had workmates, they had even, when they were forced laborers, kind of overseers, and so on. So there are always relationships, and the relationships are important for their own decision making, but they also can be part of networks. So there is also a gray zone that some of the individuals, for example, are then connected to organized resistance too, to small groups, either Jewish groups or non-Jewish groups like communists or social democrats or even conservative Christian groups. So I think this is room for kind of future research, which we need to do. And I think there is way more organizational effort among the Jewish communities, but also informal organizations. So I found a case in a previous book, for a previous research, for a book on public welfare, how the Jews were excluded from public welfare, poor Jews. And there was in a small town in West Germany an effort where a group of Jewish men and women came together to play cards and raise funds to donate the money to help poor Jews who just lost their public welfare benefits. Yeah, so that's kind of a very different form of help and also in some way resistant. Another form is that Jewish communities had to kind of organize help. For example, after Kristallnacht, and I said that my next book will be on Kristallnacht. When Jewish homes were destroyed, there was a large-scale homeless crisis among Jews. So some Jews went to family which they had in the same town, some went to relatives in other towns, some found shelter with non-Jewish friends or neighbors, but some or many actually found shelter in Jewish communities, which opened up kind of community facilities for these homeless Jews who lost their homes. Or in Vienna, the head of the Jewish community opened his private apartment for 15 Jews after Kristallnacht to shelter them. So I think this is another area where we need to more research, but you are totally right that there is way more to discover in this regard.
One last question. Is there anyone else?
Yeah, here.
Yes, no one. This will be the final question.
Professor, do you think that Jewish leadership in Germany and probably Poland as well failed the Jewish community in attempts to ameliorate what the Nazis do to the broader Jewish community? Or was it just they just didn't have the influence, or nobody really listened to it? Was it a hopeless cause? I mean, we hear these things about how brave the individuals were. What about the community organizations, the institutions, the commercial institutions, business leaderships, the professional leadership, which you probably represented all other proportions of their numbers? What could they have done, if anything?
So, regarding Jewish leadership, I would say it was again very complex. There were a lot of Jewish leaders, rabbis, who were actually outspoken, who criticized the regime. So, for example, in the 1930s in Germany, you have quite a lot of petitions of Jewish communities, kind of authored by Jewish communities against the persecution. You have rabbis who kind of spoke up in synagogues. My favorite example is Joachim Prinz, who was he wrote his memoir called The Rebellious Rabbi, and he actually was the rabbi of the last one, Daisy Gronowski. So she was in his synagogue. He was this young, very non-mainstream, unorthodox rabbi, going to parties, not liked by the kind of older Jewish leadership in Berlin. But he was extremely outspoken, so outspoken against the regime that the Gestapo pushed him to emigrate in 1937. They said, if you not go, you will go to a concentration camp. And he left, went to the United States, And then he became very engaged in the civil rights movement in the United States. He was, by the way, when you ever saw the speech of Martin Luther King, the Dream speech, he was the speaker before Martin Luther King. Yeah? And especially because he had his own experiences of persecution, which he wanted to which motivated him to be politically active. So there are quite a few rabbis who were really instrumental in Germany, but also if you look into Poland, where I'm not a specialist, but I know that in Poland, although there was a lot of complaints after the war, there were quite a few Jewish leaders in ghettos who were very instrumental in helping the resistance, trying to organize sustainability for the people, trying to negotiate. And we have to really to admit, they could never know what we know today. And this is often a tall ask to tell them you should have acted differently when we know what developed later. Not even the Nazis knew in 1938 what will happen in 1942. Not even they knew. So I think there was a lot of leadership, which what I see for Germany, where I know best, starting in 1933 with campaigns in economical aid for all the Jewish businesses who lost their clientele, who were boycotted, to create Jewish education, to compensate for the loss of public education. So there is really organized, sustainable effort, and only at the last moment you have then these crucial moments which are always discussed, where there was knowledge about the mass extermination, and how did they decide? Why didn't they tell what they knew, right? Should they have done more? But that's really, for me, in hindsight, it is, yeah.
2020 answer.
Sorry, what was the rebellious rabbi's name? The rebellious rabbi.
Joachim Prinz. Yeah, he was, and the teenager girls loved him. He did.
There's a prince amongst the rabbis.
Yeah, he was like.
Thank you.